Tonight we're going to talk about the Battle of Jericho. As I was preparing this lesson, one of the fascinating things about the city of Jericho and the Battle of Jericho and all is just a number of interesting things about the city itself, and particularly some archaeological things that have been done by biblical archaeologists. And so I'm really going to divide this lesson into a couple of different parts. The first part is going to be to take a look at the archaeology of Jericho and how it relates to the Bible. And then we'll talk about the Battle of Jericho and how it related to the people and the things that God had to say about that battle. Jericho is an interesting place. It's real strange. Jericho is 853 feet below sea level. It's right just 13 miles or so away from the north shore of the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is about 1,290 feet below sea level. On the other hand, Jerusalem is about 15 miles as the crow flies. It's about 15 miles to the west of the city of Jericho. The funny thing about it is the Dead Sea is 1,290 feet below sea level. Jerusalem is 2,133 feet above sea level. I've been there, and you get in a car in Jerusalem and you just coast all the way down, and it winds everywhere. It's a treacherous road. And the story of the Good Samaritan is almost the story of today, because there are a lot of robberies, and there are caves along the way and things like this, and it has to wind all around in order to get down, because Jericho and the Dead Sea are so very, very far below it. Jericho is an interesting place because it is the oldest city that has ever been discovered in the history of the world. The city, the ruins of the oldest part of the city, they're way down deep, of course, now, but the ruins go all the way back to the Stone Age. It's a very interesting story about how the city has been built and destroyed, rebuilt and destroyed, rebuilt again and destroyed, and they keep building in one right up on top of the other. Well, archaeology is an interesting thing, interesting area of study in reference to the city of Jericho. The city of Jericho was one of the most fascinating places for early archaeologists to explore. But the peculiar thing was that it was not until the 1800s when biblical archaeology really kind of got started there. Actually, in 1799, over in Egypt, a soldier in the service of Napoleon found a stone. And this stone had three kinds of writing on it. Greek, and then what they called Demotic, which is an Egyptian script. And then it had the hieroglyphics. And you know, everywhere you look at a picture of something in Egypt, it seemed like they've got all of these little scribbled writings, picture writings and so forth. They're all hieroglyphics. And up until 1799, well, a little later than that actually, but up until the time of the discovery of this stone, nobody could read the hieroglyphics. And there was just a world of interest in hieroglyphics, and people tried to decipher them, and they couldn't. Well, the stone fell into the hands of the British, and they carried it over to the British Museum. Very, very quickly, about 1808, I'll say quickly, about 9 years later, people began trying to decipher this thing, and they just couldn't do it. They couldn't. They just didn't know how to do it. And then there was a fellow by the name of Francois Champollion, and he he was a linguist. He was a Frenchman. He was a linguist, and he saw that the three scripts were the Demotic, which was Egyptian, and then there's a Greek script. And he knew Greek, and so he supposed that it just may be that the story that's told in Greek is the same story as told in these other languages. And so through a great deal of work, he began deciphering the hieroglyphics. And of course, as you know, this was the Rosetta Stone. It was discovered in just near a little village of Rosetta, Egypt, and this really opened the door for a great deal of information from the Egyptians. Well, a lot of things in Egypt had some kind of biblical representation to them as well. And so some archaeologists, and an archaeologist then was just somebody who dug in the ground. They didn't have any training or anything like that, but they began getting interested in the whole idea of maybe we could find out something about the culture of the ancient people of Egypt as they related to the Hebrew people. And so this started the idea, what later turned out to be called a biblical archaeology. I've got a note here about a couple of men who went to work on some of these things. One was a doctor, and the other was a lawyer. They knew each other. They were friends. They worked together some, but they had no idea of archaeological techniques or anything, because those things had not been developed very highly at that time. And so literally they just started digging. And one of them, he decided that from the descriptions in the Bible that the city of Nineveh was going to be close to an area that he was familiar with. So he went out, I guess we'd say kind of with a pick and a shovel. He went out and started digging around looking for the city of Nineveh. Well, he discovered something. He discovered just a huge thing. It was not the city of Nineveh at all, but it was a palace of an Old Testament king of Assyria by the name of Sennacherib. And this was just an enormous palace that was discovered here. Well, who was Sennacherib so far as the Bible is concerned? Well, it was a very interesting thing about Sennacherib. Sennacherib was king of Assyria when Hezekiah was the king of Judah. And so Sennacherib, as the king of the Assyrian Empire, as he was expanding his empire and all, he came over in 722 BC, and he destroyed Samaria and took the Samaritan, the Israelite people, took them captive. And then the Assyrian did that. It was not Sennacherib that did that, but it was a fellow by the name of Sargon who later did some of these things. So, but when Hezekiah became the king of Judah, Sennacherib sent his army over, and his army stopped at Jerusalem and called out to the people who are up on the wall that the great king Sennacherib is going to destroy your city if you don't surrender. And the people were scared to death. And there's a very dramatic story there over in the book of 2 Kings about how God came in and rescued the people. And the interesting thing about this is that we have here a king who is mentioned by Herodotus, the Greek historian, and the story of this king and all of this mentioned by Herodotus. And then Herodotus mentions that for some reason, although they were all ready to go to battle against Jerusalem, for some reason, the whole army of Assyria got up and ran away because some kind of disease came in. And if you read in the Bible, well, you find out that surely enough, God sent a disease to the people Some people think that this probably was a disease, bubonic plague or something like that was carried by rats. And so the whole army got up and left almost overnight. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, tells that story, not from a biblical point of view, but from the point of view of history. And so archaeology has discovered some of these things that took place with Sennacherib. And this great palace and all this sort of thing that was discovered turned out to be a very, very important thing. Well, there was another fellow. His name was Botta, John Emil Botta. And Botta began digging fairly close to this. Here he also was looking for the city of Nineveh, and he made a discovery that was extremely interesting. We'll see how all of this relates to Jericho in just a moment. But he made a discovery that was very interesting because he discovered also a big palace. This was the palace of a king by the name of Sargon. Now, who was Sargon, and what was the interest in Sargon? Well, Sargon is mentioned in the 20th chapter of the book of Isaiah, the first verse. Now, the funny thing about this is he is not mentioned in history anywhere except in the Bible. There is no account of anybody named Sargon, a king of Assyria, there's one that goes back into about the 3000s or something like that, nowhere near this. But now a discovery is made of a palace, and in this palace are what's called the Annals of Sargon. And Sargon was king, and the thing that the Bible mentions about this is that Sargon was king when Sennacherib was attacking the northern kingdom. And then the one who attacked the northern kingdom, he died before the siege was over. And Sargon was the one who completed the siege. And that's that's just the little thing that Isaiah 20 tells us about. And so the important thing is that some of the great discoveries here were made by some of these early people who were not archaeologists at all, but they had, like I say, kind of a pick and a shovel, and they were digging around trying to find some of these things. Then as time went on, techniques and all developed about how to date things, and the techniques of digging and the techniques of preserving the things that were dug up. Before very long, this came over to Jericho. A man by the name of Laird, Henry Laird, he dug a shaft. The shaft was at Jericho, and an archaeological shaft is not not that big around. It's about as wide as the aisle here, and they would dig down, and as they came to different artifacts, they would label those artifacts as a certain strata. And so he dug and dug and dug and dug, and he went way down, and for some reason or another, he thought that it was useless, and so he finally quit, and he said, there's not anything significant that we're going to find in Jericho. Well, how wrong he was. Jericho, since then, has been excavated second only to Jerusalem. And great and wonderful things have been found by archaeologists there in the city of Jericho. There was a man now by the name of John Garstang. He was a Britisher, and he, back in the early 1900s, John Garstang and a group of British archaeologists by that time, they went over to Jericho, and they began digging in Jericho, and they made a number of important discoveries. Then later in the 1930s, a group led by Garstang again went over to Jericho and did some more digging. And by that time, they were a little bit more sophisticated than they had been. And he made some discoveries, one of which he thought that he had discovered the wall that fell down in the Battle of Jericho. Later, a woman by the name of Kathleen Kenyon, she was also a very fine archaeologist, and in 1936, she went over there and she saw that the things that Garstang had thought were the ruins of ancient Jericho in the time of the Battle of Jericho, that he was mistaken in his dating of those things. And so there was a little conflict here that began taking place. Well, the way it turned out, the time of, from about 1500 to 1200 BC, which would incorporate the period of the Israelite invasion, that time period, for some unknown reason, we don't know, they've never been able to discover hardly any artifacts that came from that time period. And so the things that Garstang, although he did some great things, the things that Garstang discovered were not really the ruins of the ancient city in Jeremiah's time. Nevertheless, Jericho became a very, very important place for archaeologists to dig. Finally, one of the great things that archaeologists discovered was a group of 505 tombs. And they were spread over a number of years, a number of centuries, as a matter of fact, and they had a great deal of information there. Not only the skeleton, but the thing that they did a whole lot in ancient burials like that was they would bury food with them, they would bury clothing with them, they would bury quite a number of things with the people because of some of the beliefs that they had of the afterlife. And so these 500 or so tombs that were discovered gave a real good chronology of how the culture developed and how the customs developed in the ancient city of Jericho. And so in the Bible, the city of Jericho plays an important role. It was not rebuilt until the time of Ahab, the king of Israel. And a man began rebuilding the walls and rebuilding the city at that time. Then, of course, during the days of Jesus, the city of Jericho was a very prominent place. Jericho is still there today, a modern city. But Jericho in the days of Jesus was a resort city. King Herod had built an enormous palace. The ruins of this palace have been discovered, and it was just an enormous palace, and it's a lot of detail in the ruins that have been discovered in that city. You see, Herod was a great builder. This is Herod the Great, the one who tried to kill the baby Jesus. But Herod was a great builder, and he loved Roman architecture, and so he built a number of things in Jerusalem after Roman architecture. And then he went to Jericho, built this big palace and all this sort of thing, spent a lot of his time in Jericho because, like I say, it was a resort city. And it was built up, fashioned after some of the Roman architecture. Now, that gives us, I hope that's been interesting to you and informative to you, but that gives us some sort of an idea of the importance of the city of Jericho to the ancient people and also to the modern people. Now, we know the story of the fall of Jericho pretty well, don't we? The Israelites came and encamped at the city of Shittim. Shittim was on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. And it was here at Shittim that they sent the spies out, 2 spies, to go and spy out the land, or spy out the city of Jericho, similar to the 12 spies that went to spy out the land, 40 years earlier. Well, the Israelites had had quite an experience up to this time. The exodus from Egypt, the giving of the law of Moses, the golden calf, when they came up to the land, and 10 of the 12 spies said, no, we can't take the land. They turned back, wandering in the wilderness. They had a very checkered history all of this time. And then finally they come to the city of Shittim, which is just a few miles over the Jordan River from the city of Jericho. When those spies went out, those two who were going to spy out Jericho, when they went out, the people of Jericho had their city all locked up. They were very much afraid. But these two spies found a home where a prostitute lived. Her name was Rahab. And Rahab welcomed them into her household. And she said, we know that the Lord, and of course she was a pagan, to her that would be your God. We know that your God is guiding you, and we know that you are going to come in and take the city. We know that, and we're afraid of that. But she was good to the spies, and she hid the spies, and so she protected the spies, and they assured her that when the city fell, that she and her household would be rescued. And surely enough, when the city fell, that was a part of what they did. How did the city fall? Well, when the spies came back, preparation was made now for this whole nation to go over the Jordan River. And they did. They walked over the Jordan River. As the priest walked toward the river and stepped into the waters of the river, the river flowed down, and they walked over on dry ground. And then after the whole nation had passed over, the 12 people, one from each of the 12 tribes, would take a stone out of the riverbed and make a monument there to the fact that God had delivered them. Then they took 12 stones from the shore and brought them into the riverbed and left them there as a monument in the river. And then as the priest came out of the riverbed, the water began flowing again. So now they're over there near the city of Gilgal. Joshua said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to march around the city. Trumpets or ram's horns will be sounded, but you as a people do not make a sound. And they marched around the city. The next day they got up, they marched around the city again. I don't know what the psychology of this was, but I can imagine that the people are already afraid. And here is this mighty nation, the whole nation, and they're marching around this city, not saying a word, not making any noise, but just the sound of the trumpets. 6 days they did that, every day for 6 days. On the seventh day, Joshua said, get up early in the morning. We're going to march around the city 7 times. And they went out and they marched 1, 2, all the way up to 7 times. And then Joshua told them, he says, now, and this is an interesting statement. He says, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Wait a minute, not yet. God told Joshua in the very beginning, when he was planning this thing, he said, then I will tell you to shout, because I have given you the city. And yet they had many things to do before the city really was turned over to them. But that was the story of the strategy for capturing the city. And then the city, the walls of the city, when they shouted, the walls of the city fell down flat. Now, Jericho is on a mound. And the walls, no doubt, fell and rolled down, in part, rolled down the hill or the mound. They went in and rescued Rahab, and then they set the whole city on fire. Let's take a look for just a moment now about God and Israel and the Battle of Jericho. The first thing that I notice here is that I would think that in all probability that there were some people among the folks in the nation who were saying to themselves, this is silly, I don't see a bit of sense in this. These people are people of war, and here we are just walking around this city. I don't see what good this is doing at all. That's none of my business. That's none of your business. It's none of their business. That's God's business. You see, sometimes God asks us to do things or tells us to do things that to us make no sense. And yet, God is the one who is in charge. We're not the people who are in charge. And so, when they're walking around like this, the whole idea is that through all of this, they're showing their faith and their trust in God. They might not understand why, they might not understand what's going on, but they do understand that this is what God has said. The next thing that's interesting is the way people get impatient with God. As these people were walking around and not seeing, some of them probably not seeing any sense in this at all, can't you just imagine them saying, well, you know, we've done this for 2 days, why do we have to keep doing it? It's kind of an interesting thing because they're there about to begin the conquest of Canaan. Back in the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis, we have some interesting things. God spoke to Abraham and said, Abraham, in the 4th generation, your people, your descendants are going to come back to this land. And then he made a statement, the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. I've thought about that so many times. It was about 400 years between the time that God said that about the Amorite and the time that he finally punished these Amorites. Sometime we just have to have patience with God's way. I don't mean to be in any way political about this, but I think so much of the time about what's going on right now in the Middle East and the terrible, terrible things that are happening in the Middle East. And I keep saying to myself, why doesn't God do something about this? People are being beheaded, people are being tortured, people are being threatened and so forth. Why doesn't God intervene? Well, I don't know why. If I were God, I would have intervened a long time ago. But I'm not God and you're not God. And I have to say to myself, however, God has his own schedule, and he is not trying to operate on the schedule of Jack Burch. He's operating on his schedule, and I need to learn to operate on his schedule as well. So impatience with God, I think, is a lesson that, or patience with God rather, I think is a lesson for us to learn out of the experiences of these people at Jericho. And then an interesting statement that he makes here is what I just mentioned a moment ago. Shout, for I have given you the city. You know, God doesn't live in linear time like I do. Past, present, and future. It's all present with him because he lives in eternity, not in time. And so, to God, the present or the future are just the same as the past, or the past is just the same as the future, because there is no linear time with God. And so with God to say, I have given you the city, is an absolute assurance that what I have promised, I'm going to fulfill. And I can speak of it as if it were already done, because I'm not limited by this linear time the way you are. When God said to Abraham, Abraham, in your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. He said that, and he and Sarah could not have a child. Abraham tried to work it around, with Hagar and so forth, so that he could kind of help God out just a little bit, but God didn't need the help. But it was 25 years before Isaac was born. And so these things tell us, I think, that when God makes a promise, it's as good as done, folks. But it depends on our fidelity. It depends on our fidelity many times for God to accomplish with us individually what he wants to accomplish. And so the Battle of Jericho tells us something about the support the archaeologists find for the biblical text. That's not their only idea by any means. The story of the Battle of Jericho tells us something about patience and impatience. It tells us something about the promises of God and how real those promises are, and just exactly how vividly they will be fulfilled. And so surely enough, when the people shouted, the walls fell down flat, just like God had said. Let's have faith that God's will may be accomplished in us, just as it was in the people who stood there at Jericho.